what is your assessment of the ongoing lobbying efforts in the U.S. for Somaliland recognition?
So I think those that are supporting the Somaliland cause in Washington, D.C. have made some headway.
Yeah.
And so this has been going on for some time, picked up the last couple of years especially, and now maybe even more so under the new administration, or at least some expectations. There's been a few champions of the cause, and they're very vocal. Now, I should caveat this, first of all, there's not a great deal of focus on Africa, let alone the Horn of Africa in Washington, D.C.
Welcome to Maamul Wanaag, a podcast by the Somali Public Agenda. My name is 𝗦𝘁𝘁𝘂𝘀𝘚. I am the Executive Director of Somali Public Agenda and the host of Maamul Wanaag Podcast. There's currently an active campaign in the United States urging President Trump to recognize Somaliland. Meanwhile, the future of the African Union mission in Somalia, known as AUSSOM, remains uncertain. 𝗬𝘰𝘵𝗵 is the International Crisis Group, 𝗦𝘵𝐺, Senior Horn of Africa Analyst. He is the Senior Analyst for Somalia, particularly, and the wider Horn of Africa. He conducts field research, provides analysis, proposes policy recommendations, and engages in advocacy on Somalia and the wider Horn. I will be discussing two different but equally important topics with him here in Mogadishu, where he is visiting. Omar, glad to have you here at SPA and Maamul Wanaag Podcast.
Thank you, Mahad. So excited to be here on Maamul Wanaag and for the conversation.
Yeah, we had different discussions early on off the record. Now we are...
Now we're on the record.
We are on the record, yeah. So we will start with Somaliland. What is your assessment of the ongoing lobbying efforts in the U.S. for Somaliland recognition?
So I think those that are supporting the Somaliland cause in Washington, D.C. have made some headway.
Yeah.
And so this has been going on for some time, picked up the last couple of years especially, and now maybe even more so under the new administration, or at least some expectations. There's been a few champions of the cause, and they're very vocal. Now, I should caveat this, first of all, there's not a great deal of focus on Africa, let alone the Horn of Africa in Washington, D.C. And this isn't necessarily a mainstream dynamic either. But there are a few vocal supporters, especially within the conservative elements of the Republican Party. And I think we've seen some of this. Ted Cruz most recently wrote a letter to Donald Trump, and that's probably one of the best well-known names. But there's a few others around that. And they've sort of made this argument that U.S. interests would be better served by engaging Somaliland, even potentially to the point of recognition, or at least that's part of their argument. And there's a couple of reasons for this. One is the strategic location of Somaliland, and particularly the port of Berbera. U.S. has a bit of a history there, and some interest from the military side to be using that location. There's also the China angle, which plays well with some conservative elements of the Republican Party. They see Somaliland as close ties to Taiwan, kind of positioning itself against China in that dynamic. They see the relative stability of Somaliland and see an attractive partner there. And I think some, but not all, also tie it to then some frustration with the U.S. policy in Somalia itself, and argue Somaliland would be a better fit. So I think this has made, within this niche circle that focuses on African politics in Washington, D.C., a bit of inroads. But I think it's harder to say whether that's really impacting within the Trump administration, because this is an administration that hasn't really filled a lot of its positions on Africa, or really made up a lot of its policy on Africa just yet.
Yes, so you touched on the strategic location of particularly Berbera port. So what has changed in terms of the American policy towards the Horn, and why Berbera is now more strategic for the U.S. than before?
Yeah, I think it's a couple reasons. I think Berbera was always strategic. It just wasn't something that maybe was envisioned in the same sort of way. So a couple things. So first of all, there's the U.S. presence already in Djibouti. And so some supporters argue that the U.S. needs to diversify from Djibouti for a variety of reasons. One also ties into the geopolitical angle with China. China, of course, has a military presence in Djibouti as well. That came up, I think, around 2017 or so. So it's really, within the last decade. And so that's one element of it. And you get different versions whether the U.S. would whether some are arguing for the U.S. to replace Djibouti or some arguing for diversification. So using Berbera in that sort of way. I think we've also then seen the maritime space amongst the Red Sea and the entranceway to the Red Sea change in the last couple of years. This has always been a very contested space. It's a very strategic space in terms of you look at the amount of trade that goes through this. We've had the issues with the Houthi attacks on ships over the past 2 years or so. And so I think that also raises up kind of the strategic importance of a location like that. And then, of course, you kind of have, some infrastructure arguments. People argue about how long the runway is in Berbera and whatnot. And so I think all of that combined has maybe sort of increased or put Berbera more on the radar, I'd say.
Yeah, so that momentum has increased the Berbera and been used as a main selling point for Somaliland recognition. So how is 𝗪𝘗𝘂 responding to these developments in the U.S. and what is its role in what's going on there? There are some people saying there is an active lobbying groups and financed by the Somaliland, from think tanks to politicians to journalists and all these.
Yeah, so I think Somaliland, and remember there was a new administration that took power at the end of last year, around the same time as the U.S. election as well. So we had two different administrations coming in, two new ones coming into power at the same time. So I think Somaliland initially was a little cautious. The new government there was focused on some domestic issues, domestic reconciliation, some engagement out in 𝗪𝘗𝘁𝘗 and 𝗪𝘗𝘴 in these sorts of areas. I think that took up a lot of their attention, a lot of their focus, at least early on. And there was also kind of maybe this idea from some that Trump is so unpredictable. Maybe on day one he might do something, and then of course that didn't happen. And so then I think that faded a little bit. More recently, though, I think Somaliland's kind of re-engaging on this a little bit. We've seen some comments from President 𝗍𝘗, for example, in Berbera recently, kind of arguing that recognition will come within his tenure. And so I think we've seen them engage a little bit more on this. Somaliland's foreign minister also said President 𝗍𝘗 will travel to the U.S. at some point, and so we see some signs around that. Having said that, though, I think there's a bit of a competition going on to attract the eye of the Trump administration from Somaliland, but also Somalia itself, and so this doesn't happen in a vacuum. There's responses around that. And I think both sides are trying to present a package that is attractive to the Trump administration. And there's probably, I would argue there's kind of 5 C's of Trump's engagement in Africa if you're trying to attract Trump in Africa. And so everyone's trying to probably hit these notes. And so that's counterterrorism, that is critical minerals, that is commercial access, that is China, so an anti-China lens, and then that's cooperation, diplomatically especially, with Trump's political agenda. And so I think you see both sides actively trying to engage in Washington, D.C. and around and really present themselves as the better case along as many of those areas as they can. Yeah,
so not only 𝗪𝘗𝘂 is, but also the federal government are countering that narrative in the U.S. as well. One of the recent developments in Somalia that the federal government has partly, I could say, played the most critical role is the formation of the northeastern state, which is an ongoing process, which is to be finalized probably in the next few days. And how does this recognition efforts in the U.S. reflect the realities on the ground, particularly when this administration falls under the jurisdiction of the British Somaliland?
Yeah, so I think, partly a lot of times when you're lobbying in D.C. or you have champions in D.C., nuance is lost a lot of times. And it's sort of more top-level engagement and top-level narratives. So what's happening in this eastern part, I do think is basically a reflection of the complexities of this sort of question. It's not a black or white. There's a lot more gray to it. And so, I think this brought up the point that what Somaliland has achieved is impressive in a lot of ways in terms of institution building, in terms of stability, but it hasn't been total. So it doesn't expand to all of the colonial boundaries of which they base their independence claim on. Mm-hmm. And so the war in La Sanod in 2023 brought this up. There was not really a political solution to that after. Now we've gone to a new period where, those who rose up are forming a member state that Mogadishu is recognizing. And so I think there's a number of layers to that. And, it kind of brings home the complexity of the issue. It brings home the issue of stability in this part as well. And so I do think that nuance is sometimes not really represented fully in Washington, D.C. It's lost a little bit. But I think it's a very complicated picture, especially in the East.
If you look at the how other parts become independent from their countries, at least in this part of the world, in Eritrea and in South Sudan, the country have allowed them to become an independent from them. And the argument has always been unity or separation has to go through Mogadishu Road. Yeah. It has to be something that you discuss with Mogadishu. And given the current situation where there is an active lobby for recognition of Somaliland in the U.S., what and your understanding of U.S. politics, how might that proceed?
Yeah. So I think just first on the precedent sort of question. I mean, you're right. We have two cases in Africa, really the Horn of Africa, both South Sudan and Eritrea. And that precedent did require an agreement from the other country. Now, neither of those are great cases either, because we still had conflict in both of them for different sort of reasons. Yeah. So I think Somaliland would argue that's not the best precedent, and would also argue that they've already been governing themselves for a couple decades. But of course, the precedent is there as well, and so I think it goes both ways, and that's what makes the Somaliland case so complex. That it doesn't necessarily fit in a lot of the boxes, and that's why it's gone unresolved for so long. Somaliland would also argue they've engaged a lot of times over the past decade, and then we just haven't really seen a result from that also. And so I think you can interpret that precedent either way, depending on what argument you're making. In terms of where, the U.S. stands now, I'm not privy to any inside discussion, and I'm not representing the government, but, I wouldn't expect a sudden move per se. Of course, though, Trump is unpredictable. He's surprised us many times in the past. But partly I say that because recognition is kind of a big ask. It's not just something that's decreed by a tweet or something like that. The ground has to be prepared. Yeah. And it's something like, okay, then what happens also next, in terms of what is the engagement, what is the outcome. And so I think, having said that, there's also kind of this confluence sometimes that people make between U.S. Somaliland and then U.S. Somalia. It doesn't necessarily have to be, a zero-sum dynamic here. The U.S. could very well maintain counterterrorism support here in Somalia and engage Somaliland. They could very well disengage from both as well, or pick one or the other. But I kind of see it as it's not necessarily going to be a one or the other thing. I do think you'll see greater U.S. engagement with Somaliland. I think the U.S. sees some sort of value there, but to what level is certainly unclear. I think what I would argue, what my organization would probably argue, is that what would be very helpful would be if there's an external actor like the U.S. that's interested in this question, that could use its leverage to bring the parties together. Now, I know there's been discussions in the past, and they haven't really worked out, and there's a lot of reasons for that. Partly, they've been start and stop.
Yeah.
And then there's always been a change of administration, one or the other. One's going into election cycle, one's coming out, and whatnot. So you haven't really had any continuity.
Yeah.
And at the same time, you haven't had necessarily, I would say, a big power take strong continued interest in this. We had Turkey, which of course hosted discussions, but again, they didn't really amount to much. And, I think both sides would make an argument. Somalia would say we've engaged and Somaliland hasn't changed its position. Somaliland would say we've engaged and Mogadishu hasn't followed up on some of the things that we agreed to. I think if there's the strong interest in Washington, D.C., a strong interest from the U.S., which again I think is amongst some supporters. I don't think it's necessarily at the administrative level just yet. It could be useful to maybe then use that leverage and pressure to start some sort of process and use that especially the clout they have to break through blockages that we've had in the past. Because I think that's been part of the problem why it's been so start and stop, and why over 30 years, this issue hasn't been resolved. And I would argue it really holds back the entire region, not having a resolution one way or the other.
Yeah, thanks. I think we have covered well this. And we can now turn into the African Union mission, support and stabilization mission in Somalia. You have been writing a lot about the security sector in Somalia. And what is your assessment of the AUSSOM mission at its current status?
AUSSOM is imperfect. We should say that, but I think it is still an essential part of the security architecture here in Somalia. And we should remember it's just one part. There's other aspects to this. Yeah. There's the training of the SNA. There's bilateral forces. There's drone packages. There's a lot of other aspects that go into the security architecture here, and especially external support to the security architecture. But I still think AUSSOM mission is a very crucial component to that. And I think we see its importance in a number of ways. One thing that we can sort of compare and contrast just over the last couple weeks and months is you look at what's happened in 𝗵𝘁 and you look at what's happened in 𝗵𝘁 with regards to the war against Al-Shabaab. In 𝗵𝘁, Al-Shabaab's advanced quite a bit. In 𝗵𝘁, to the point that they've advanced into Haran as well, 𝗵𝘁𝗵𝘁𝘁. In 𝗵𝘁, Al-Shabaab was also advancing along the road to 𝗪𝘵, but we've had a response that involved the AUSSOM mission. They've been able to take back some of the towns, Berbera and 𝗏𝗏𝗏 in that sort of area. So I think that shows the value of the mission is still there. It is imperfect. There's a lot of issues with it. There's been a lot of issues with all three of the missions. I would argue AUSSOM is fundamentally not that much different than ATMIS and AMISOM before it. It's really a continuation of the longer trend. There's still obviously issues with TCCs, the troop contributing countries, some of them here for their own interests, and the lack of coordination. And so certainly a lot of challenges there. But I do think the mission is still quite crucial to sort of buy more time, essentially, for Somali security forces to take on that primary security responsibility. And with this mission, technically, it has a mandate to the end of the decade. That's a much longer timeline than the ATMIS transition. ATMIS transition, I always felt was very quick, very rushed. There was the idea that all of this would happen in 33 months. While it was being negotiated in the midst of an election cycle and whatnot. So the longer timeline here is useful in some sense. But having said that, I think part of the dynamic is of course the mission could be a little more efficient as well. It could be a little more active. One thing that was sort of formalized, I think now is a difference from AUSSOM, which is AUSSOM was quite offensive. Now, if you look at the way the mission is structured and whatnot, I argue the continuation of the same mission, but one change has been the mission's more sort of envisioned to be more defensive. And so there's been this informal recognition that the mission is best placed being a defensive force and allowing Somali forces to go on the offensive. But removing that defensive capacity would still have some gaps then.
Yeah, so initially the plan was to significantly reduce the ATMIS forces and to empower the Somali forces, but with some package from AUSSOM forces. And when the troop contributing countries met in Kampala, they have proposed another 8,000 more forces more to the mission. So what has changed? And the Somali government has been lobbying for reducing the number, and then the things the narrative is shifting towards the need for more forces.
So I think there was always a tension in terms of when there was the negotiations ongoing for what would happen after ATMIS. First there was a recognition from the Somali government to say we need a follow-on mission. So that was kind of the first question. Is ATMIS the end of this story, or is there a follow-on mission? I think the AU and a lot of the partners felt there needed to be a follow-on mission, and in Somalia also came with that request at the end of December 2023. Then the second question was, then what's the size of that mission? And there was some disagreement here between the Somali government arguing for something smaller, between the AU saying, for us to actually just be able to protect ourselves, we actually need more forces on the ground. And you can interpret a lot of different motivations around both of those positions as well. But I think that was a fundamental tension, and there was a compromise. And so they settled eventually around 12,000 troops, 11,900 essentially, size of the force.
Yeah.
And they were trying to scale down the number of locations at least. So to concentrate these in a number of areas with the idea that this would free up some mobile forces. It would allow the new AUSSOM mission to, yes, be defensive, but still have this offensive capacity. Because if you're occupying many different forward operating bases, you have to staff all of those accordingly. And then you don't have other forces freed up. And so the idea was to at least concentrate this. I think that shifted over time. And part of the change is what happened on the ground with regards to Al-Shabaab. And the offensive they launched starting in February of this year, and them being able to take back some ground in areas that in a lot of cases they weren't targeting the mission itself, but targeting SNA or 𝗏𝘓 or whatnot. But they kind of changed that momentum, and I think that then started affecting some of the planning for the mission. And so you saw the number of locations increase again, which then has that knock-on effect of where would these mobile forces come from. And it's hard to see maybe that materializing at this current standpoint. And so I think when that Kampala meeting happened, there was still that idea that there needed to be more foreign forces on the ground, and that's where that 8,000 request came in. I think it's hard to see that through the mission structure, but one thing we're also seeing is increasing bilateralization of the Somali security framework. It's been very multilateral to date through the AU mission, but as that drawdown happens, you're not necessarily removing the amount of overall foreign forces in the country, but some of them are shifting to bilateral positions. And so that's where, some of the gaps are kind of being made up in that sort of way.
Yeah, so shifting to the funding situation, the new mission has struggled with funding, and the European Union, that has been funding, covering most of the funding, has shown that they can no longer continue the same funding level. And what is the current status of AUSSOM funding, and who are the countries who are open to fill that EU gap?
Yeah, I mean, to be frank, the funding situation is bleak. We should remember the ATMIS mission ran a deficit of almost $100 million. The budget for the AU mission now is around 166 million just for the stipends. Remember, there's a separate UN logistical package that goes on with the mission, and that's funded from UN contributions, and that seems more or less secure for the moment. U.S. Funding to the overall UN peacekeeping budget could affect that. But the question we're talking about funding here is really for the stipends for the troops. And so we have around $166 million budget for 2025, and the AU says they have about 15% of that. Most of that is from the AU itself through their Crisis Reserve Fund, which is part of the AU Peace Fund that they've drawn from. There's very small contributions from a couple countries like a Japan, like a South Korea. And so there's a massive gap for 2025, and then there's no pledges for 2026. Now, for 2025 still, even though we're so far into the year, there is an expectation that the EU will provide funding. I don't think they want to put a specific number on that yet, but it seems around the range of there's about 60 million euros reserved for Somalia security. The breakdown between the AU and what would go to Somalia is unclear, but that's a significant chunk. There's an expectation that the UK would also fund a small chunk. They've been doing that, especially since Brexit. So if you added all that up, you probably get to about, at best case, 2/3 of your budget for 2025. It says nothing about the previous debts and nothing about 2026. So this idea of getting sustainable, predictable funding for the mission, I think, looks more far off than ever. There's been a couple attempts to find a solution to this. You know, one of the most prominent was this idea that maybe the stipends could also come under UN-assessed contributions. So this was Resolution 2719, which was this big thing negotiated between the UN and the AU about UN support for African Union peacekeeping operations. Now, unfortunately, in May of 2025, the deadline for that came, and the AU and all the partners were never able to convince the US to support this application of 2719 in Somalia. The US feels like it's not the right case, and so it was blocked. I think that would have been a route that would have solved a lot of this. There still would have been some challenges there, but it would have provided a lot more clarity. So in the absence of that, I think no one really had a clear plan B, and everyone's scrambling a little bit. There's talk of maybe a funding sort of conference in the next month or so that could bring in some donations. But the problem is, you know, you're still just chasing something kind of almost ad hoc, right? You're just chasing year to year. There's not something kind of set in stone for a longer time. And a lot of this then eyes fall back on the EU because they've been the one funding for so long. The EU's been quite clear for a long time that they want to see more burden sharing on this, that they don't feel stipends is the best use of their money, and that they've been reducing their contributions, and no one's filled the gap. This is why ATMIS ran a deficit as well. So no one else has just really stepped into the plate and haven't really been able to square that. So I think it's an odd situation where, you know, there's kind of almost widespread political agreement that there should be a continuation of the mission. But there's very little financial agreement.
Commitment.
And so it's almost a brinksmanship game, almost sort of a free rider problem. Because I would argue, you know, almost every foreign actor here in Somalia benefits from the presence of the mission in some sort of way, or what the mission's done over the past, 15 plus years. But it's getting harder and harder to find the funding to keep it going.
So when we have probably 2/3 of the 2025 budget, which is almost ending now, we are in August, and no clarity on 2026 budget, who is filling this gap, and what is the implication is of this funding gap to the operation of the AUSSOM?
Yeah, I mean, essentially the troops are serving, the countries are incurring, costs of that. And so this is why ATMIS was at a deficit. But, they continue to be present in the country. So I think it is a challenge, and it's a significant challenge going forward. It does have an operational impact in terms of, it would affect capacity. And morale and these other sorts of aspects on top of that. So, there was this idea that AUSSOM would have an offensive component, whether that was in the mobile forces element we discussed, or whether, they'd be supporting Somali forces in joint operations from 2027 to 2029. That was kind of in the CONOPS, the operational planning of the mission. But if you don't have the funding, it makes it more difficult. Capacity gaps will obviously be there. I don't think it's to the point where, you'd expect the mission to pack up and leave. I think, again, if we talk about interests of countries for being here, there's varied interests, but some of the neighbors came even before they were part of the AU mission. They still have their security interests, Kenya and Ethiopia continuing afterwards. And I don't think anyone wants to necessarily see that outcome either. But I do think you'd have kind of two factors that would come into play, and one is the capacity of the mission being eroded. So when they are called on to do some sort of operations, what position are they to be able to fulfill that? Mm-hmm. And does capacity erode to a point where at some level they're just sort of almost sitting ducks? They're just kind of sitting there and not able to do that much else, because they don't have wider funding around that. There's probably some sort of tipping point mm-hmm. where, maybe there's not as much utility if you can't find a little bit more funding for them to be more active. And then the second one is I think what we discussed already is a bit of this shift from a multilateral to bilateral framework. So if there's just not the funding there for multilateral frameworks, it seems in certain cases, there's bilateral options. We've seen that happen with Uganda, with potentially Djibouti now, some bilateral agreements and having troops in place. And so I think we're kind of shifting towards that sort of model. And certain actors might prefer that. The Somali government might prefer that because it gives them a bit more agency. At the same time, a multilateral framework, as complicated as it was, and difficult to coordinate, still had, I would argue, a coordination advantage over a series of bilateral agreements, which, countries will come in for their own interest even more strongly, and it will be very difficult, I think, to manage and coordinate that all in some sort of coherent fashion as well. But I think those are kind of two of the impacts where we will see as the funding issue, if it doesn't get resolved. It's not necessarily, this is the end of the mission and everyone just kind of leaves all of a sudden one day. But I think you have a slow erosion of kind of what the security architecture was mm-hmm. and some challenges then to that going forward in those ways.
So this leads me to the exit strategy question. When AUSSOM came in 2007, after a decade, 2016-17, there was a discussion about AUSSOM exit strategy, and it turned into 𝗏𝗔𝘗𝑚𝑖s, and then 𝗏𝗏𝗏𝑚𝑖s then became AUSSOM, and now we are experiencing some serious funding gap and more bilateral engagements mm-hmm. than multilateral. So how do you see the potential exit strategy for this mission that has been ongoing for 17 years now? It's very, very long, complicated mission, and everybody would like to see it ends. Yeah. But given the circumstances they are in and the realities on the ground at the moment, what is your assessment of the exit scenarios for AUSSOM?
Yeah, and I think we can reinforce the idea that AUSSOM is important for the Somali security architecture mm-hmm. as it currently stands, but it's certainly not the long-term solution. It's never been. It's the idea is to pave the way for the long-term solution, provide that space. Yeah, and the AU missions have been here for a long time, and I think there is increasing a clamor for them to sort of find a viable way out and sort of pack up and leave. And this is part of the reflection of the funding discussion. I mean, the funders are tired of this as well. Right? So it's not just here in Somalia that sometimes you see that call. I mean, you're seeing it elsewhere, that the whole thing is a reflection of that. Part of the challenge, I think, twofold with the exit strategies. First of all, the exit strategy has always been premised on sort of shifting the burden of who is the lead fighter, or who is the lead actor in the fight against 𝗕𝗵, rather than a resolution. So if you look at most peacekeeping missions around the world, those most successful ones are those tied to a political objective.
Political settlements.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Something of that nature. In this case, the exit strategy is just the AU will leave and the Somalia government and Somali security forces will take over. It's not necessarily a resolution of the conflict in a sense. It's just that there's more confidence for the Somali government and forces to be the lead actor in that fight. So I think that's always been a challenge around the mission and the exit strategy.
Yeah.
The second issue is, what I think, some of our work has just pointed out at times is a lot of the challenges aren't necessarily purely security driven, but also they have politics behind them. There's a political element behind this. So if you're looking at kind of the development of the Somali National Army, of course there's technical things to be done on that standpoint. That there's security perspective you need there, but there's also a lot of politics behind that. And so if you don't resolve the politics, you don't get to an integrated security force, or you don't get to a security force that is coherent to be able then to take on 𝗕𝗵. And so again, we have this disconnect where all the planning for AUSSOM and the missions and whatnot happen, I would argue, siloed from political realities and other sorts of dynamics. And they're never tied to each other either. The exit strategy is tied to some very specific
political objectives. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, it's been tied to very specific sort of security ground objectives. You achieve this and then troops come down. It's divorced from some of the political realities at times.
Yeah.
And we can just think to the @MIS planning that I mentioned earlier. I mean, the negotiations for that were happening in the midst of a political cycle in Somalia. It didn't seem the right time to be negotiating the end of that mission. And so what we have here is an opportunity, because the new timeline bought an additional 5 years, funding permitting, of course. But technically on paper, there's an agreement, a mandate for 5 more years through the end of this decade. But I think the question
2030.
For AUSSOM, technically the mandate would run to the end of 2029.
Yeah.
So of course it has to be renewed every year at the Security Council and at the AUPSC, Peace and Security Council. But that's the plan on paper. So that is a very significant timeline.
Yeah.
But the question is, what will be done differently 5 years from now in order for that to happen? We've had multiple exit inflection points missed. Multiple times there's been an idea to draw down troops to reduce. Troops have drawn down, but of course the mission is still here as a whole. And so I think there needs to be more thinking in terms of not just on the security side, but how it connects to the wider politics, how you connect this to political progress. Because, I think we see that as kind of one of the blockages then of security progress. And as long as you don't make that political advancement, then you're always going to have the questions around the security. And 5 years from now, we could be having a similar discussion.
So why do you think the mission future exit was not tied with the political realities? Why was that the case?
Well, I think part of it is, some see this more as a war-fighting mission than a peace mission or a peace operation itself. It came into it immediately was deployed into very significant conflict with essentially al-Shabaab. And so I think it came in from that standpoint of, it was part of a wider response. There was a wider sort of effort at state building here in Somalia that was backed up very significantly from external actors, primarily Western actors, the US, the UK, the EU. And so the AU mission was just one part of it. It wasn't necessarily the whole response. So it was seen as just the security component. There's a wider state building dynamic going on, and we'll just buy some space, develop the Somali security forces, and then they'll take over, and we won't need the AU mission anymore. But I don't think there was ever a deeper understanding of kind of the politics around, and partly this is because there was such an urgency on counterterrorism. Remember, a lot of this also happened during the height of the U.S. global war on terror. There was a lot of focus on rolling back 𝗕𝗵 as quickly and fastly as possible, and worrying about some of the other political issues sort of later. And so I think that also kind of divorced the connection the fact that the AU mission was just one response out of the wider part, and then the fact that there was such urgency from partners, from others, to just roll back Shabaab as much as possible. And so if you were probably designing this mission in a perfect world and from scratch, you probably wouldn't have designed it this way. But a lot of things just sort of evolved that way over time due to some of these considerations and constraints.
Yeah. So and finally, given that this AUSSOM mission mandate ends by end of 2029, what do you think can be done differently for the mission to have a very good exit?
So I would argue that there would have to be significant political, I mean, we can call it reconciliation if we want, but some sort of coherent political vision for the future of the country. And so you can see this across a number of different lines. Of course, this has come up in the battle on the Constitution recently, over the elections. There's a difference of vision of what federalism should be in Somalia, of what governance should be, how it should function. I think there needs to be a coherence around that.
Yeah.
There's always been this issue between the federal government and the member states. We see this between the federal government in Puntland right now, which has suspended its relations for almost 2 years. Without overcoming some of those challenges, then I think it becomes very difficult to develop the security sector because there's no trust there. So people will see the security as, oh, well, that's Mogadishu's security, or this is Puntland security, or this is this state's, this is so and so's security.
Yeah.
So you don't develop that then coherent national security force, and then if you don't have that, it's much harder to take on Shabaab, and it's much harder to be able to have the widespread trust that mission, that security force can now be the sole security force in the country, and therefore you default to an external actor. So I think making progress on that sort of political question, particularly about the governance question, and coming to a common vision of just exactly how the model here should function in Somalia, and bringing everyone on board there. And that trickles down at lower levels within federal member states themselves. A lot of them have very significant fault lines at the district level, at the clan level. But I think making progress on that question is what would unlock the wider security progress.
Many thanks, Omar, for that very, very insightful conversation on Somaliland and AUSSOM. Maamul Wanaag Podcast is produced by Somali Public Agenda. You can listen and watch to our podcasts and read our publications on our website, somalipublicagenda.org. You can also follow our work on our social media accounts. And thanks for listening. If you have ideas on governance topics to discuss on our next podcast episodes, you can reach out to us at podcasts@somalipublicagenda.org. And if you enjoy this podcast, we welcome your rating, particularly those who are listening us on Spotify and Apple Podcasts.